Hello, my name's Roger Watson and welcome to this session on the gastrointestinal system. The gastrointestinal system runs from the mouth to the anus. It's responsible for the ingestion and the digestion of food and the excretion of waste products. Topologically, it actually lies outside of the body because the gastrointestinal tract is a continuous tube from the mouth to the anus. Before you start, you might want to look at this Bozeman biology YouTube link on the digestive system. Now this diagram with the abdomen cutaway shows where the various parts of the gastrointestinal system lie, running from the mouth and the salivary glands through the esophagus, which joins the mouth to the stomach, and then various tubes, very convoluted and complex to see in that particular diagram, right down to the rectum and finally to the anus at the end of the digestive system. And the various components are labelled there. We'll look at these on the way through this particular session. I wouldn't worry too much about this diagram and the labelling at this point. This diagram, which is quite clever and very abstract, shows the gastrointestinal tract laid out rather like an underground railway system. In red, you've got the gastrointestinal tract from the esophagus down through the stomach and small intestine down to the large intestine. Then the large intestine is shown in blue down to the rectum. There's an appendage there called the appendix, which serves no useful function in humans. And you can see that feeding into the gastrointestinal tract at the small intestine is the liver, gallbladder in green, and the pancreas shown in orange. Various secretions are secreted into the small intestine at that point there. We'll come back to that later, but you can see that running from the esophagus down through the stomach, small intestine, large intestine and rectum is one continuous tube. The organs of the gastrointestinal system are all contained in the peritoneum. In fact, they're contained in the peritoneal cavity. The peritoneum has a transparent membrane that lines the abdominal cavity in mammals and covers most of the viscera. And this section of the human body, looked at from the right hand side, shows a section through the peritoneal cavity and the organs of the gastrointestinal system. The fact that the tubes are convoluted and folded up means that they show up several times here, and you can see various parts of the peritoneum there. For example, you can see how every aspect of the gastrointestinal system is attached by a fold of peritoneum to the back of the abdomen, and there are some particular folds. One particular one's called the omentum, or the greater omentum. That's a fold of peritoneum that lies over the front of the gastrointestinal system. The mesenteries are folds of peritoneum that support the intestines, but they also provide blood and a nervous supply. Here's a section of small intestine lifted out, and that transparent membrane that you can see is the mesentery, and you can see running through it the blood vessels. The general structure of the gastrointestinal system is that it's composed of smooth muscle, and smooth muscle is under the control of the autonomic or the involuntary nervous system. Now, we've previously encountered cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle is the second kind of muscle, and later on we will look at skeletal muscle, but let's look at smooth muscle here. Smooth muscle is composed of cells which have a loose network around them of contractile material. At the top you see when the contractile material is relaxed you have a long smooth muscle, and at the bottom when the contractile material is contracted you have a contracted smooth muscle cell. And that's how smooth muscle works, by contracting and relaxing by means of these contractile proteins which are bound around these small cells. The smooth muscle of the gastrointestinal system is arranged in two planes, one longitudinal and one circular. So if you take a section, as shown in this electron micrograph, through the wall of the gastrointestinal tract, you'll see that the section cuts through the ends of some fibres which are running in one direction, and you can see the other fibres on the left running in the other direction. It's hard to tell from this diagram which is which, but if the ones on the left are the ones running longitudinally along the length of the tract, then the other ones on the right are the circular ones running round it. Perhaps better seen in this diagram here, the longitudinal muscle is on the outside and the circular muscle is on the inside, and the space in the middle is called the lumen. Don't worry too much about the other structures shown here. These are the plexi which contain the nerves, and the mucosa which lines the lumen. The arrangement of muscles in the gastrointestinal system allows a specific movement called peristalsis. And peristalsis is defined as waves of contraction and relaxation which propel food along the gastrointestinal tract. And this diagram shows peristalsis. You can see the green bolus of food being moved from left to right. In front of the bolus the muscle is relaxed, and behind it it contracts. These are the circular muscles contracting and pushing the bolus along the length of the gastrointestinal tract. And this diagram shows what that looks like. Just watch it again. Circular muscle contraction preceded by relaxation. And the bolus moves from top to bottom of the diagram. This is not under any kind of voluntary control. It's a reflex once a bolus of food enters the gastrointestinal tract. The gastrointestinal tract, as I've pointed out already, contains a lumen, or a space, and that is lined with mucosa, and mucosa is composed of cells which secrete mucus, which is a substance that helps to lubricate the contents of the gastrointestinal tract. The mucosa of the gastrointestinal tract are both secretory and absorptive. This is not an absolute division anywhere in the tract, but it tends to be secretory at the top of the tract and more absorptive at the bottom. So in this diagram, in the red region it tends to be secretory, and in the blue region it tends to be more absorptive. But as I say, this is not an absolute division of labour between the different parts, it's just a tendency. So we'll look at the various parts of the gastrointestinal tract now. First of all we have the mouth, then the esophagus, and then the stomach, followed by the small intestine, the large intestine, the rectum, finally the anus. Also associated with the gastrointestinal tract are the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the liver. First of all, let's look at the mouth and what it contains. It contains teeth and the tongue and the salivary glands as shown in the next diagram. Here we can see the teeth. We're all familiar with where these are from our own mouth. There are different kinds of teeth. That's not particularly important to the present session. The soft palate at the back of the mouth with the vulva hanging down and the tongue. And here you can see the position of the major salivary glands. There's a very large one called the parotid gland underneath the ear. You can sometimes feel this contracting when you smell or sense or taste food. Underneath the tongue there's the sublingual glands. You can actually raise your tongue and see the outlets from the sublingual glands. And in the side of the mouth there's the submandibular glands. The function of the various parts of the mouth are that the teeth is for breaking food into smaller particles. The tongue, while it is an organ of taste, is mainly there to help in chewing and swallowing. It forms food into a bolus, which is then pushed to the back of the mouth and swallowing, which we will look at. As I say, it does taste, but most of our sensation of taste actually is afforded through our sense of smell. The salivary glands secrete saliva, which lubricates the food in the mouth, and while it does begin carbohydrate digestion, that's not a very important function of the saliva. The process of chewing and swallowing food is known as mastication. And here's a cross-section of the mouth which shows all of these structures together. You can see just how large the tongue is. Again, you can see the salivary glands and where the teeth are situated. Mastication or chewing is enabled by the muscles of mastication. These are the temporalis muscle and the masseter muscle. And here you can see the temporalis muscle and the masseter muscle. The masseter muscle is a very strong muscle which enables the movement of the bottom jaw up and down in the chewing of food. And we also have the temporomandibular joint, and this allows movement in 3 planes as we're chewing. We chew up and down and to the side and in a circular motion. And there's the temporomandibular joint. And here it is shown larger. There's a small disc of cartilage which the end of the bottom jaw sits in, and this can move in 3 planes. So the temporomandibular joint allows movement in 3 planes. And chewing is a prelude to swallowing food. Watch what's happening in this diagram here. We have a structure there called the trachea at the front, which you've already met in the respiratory lectures. And we also have a tube at the back, which is not labelled here. The thin tube there, that's the esophagus. Watch what happens when the food is swallowed. A structure called the epiglottis comes down over the trachea to save food from entering what's called the windpipe. Next, the esophagus. Food is propelled down the esophagus by peristalsis, a mechanism which we've already met. The trachea, or the windpipe, is protected by the epiglottis. And here's the food being propelled down the esophagus by a peristaltic wave, and it ultimately ends up in the stomach, and we will look at the structure of the stomach next. The stomach is essentially a food reservoir. It completes the mechanical breakdown of food by the movement of the stomach. These are very powerful movements. It initiates protein digestion and produces a substance called chyme, and this is the substance which then moves into the small intestine for the rest of digestion. Now this diagram shows the position of the stomach relative to the esophagus. Please note the US spelling without an O at the beginning of esophagus. Both of these spellings are correct, it just depends which textbook you look at. Here we have a cutaway of the stomach that shows an area at the top which is called the fundus, and there's a sphincter, the lower esophageal sphincter at the top. This is a functional sphincter. It's not really a sphincter in the sense of having a ring of smooth muscle. It's formed by the fold of the esophagus over the stomach at that position. But there's a proper sphincter down at the end of the stomach, the pyloric sphincter, which controls the entry of chyme into the small intestine. Notice the convoluted structure of the stomach. These areas are known as rugae, and these allow expansion of the stomach when food is swallowed. So the surface is convoluted, and this allows for expansion. The stomach, unlike the rest of the gastrointestinal tract, has three muscle layers. It's got a longitudinal and circular layer, just like the rest of the gastrointestinal tract. It also has an oblique layer, as shown in the next diagram. There's the longitudinal layer, there's the circular layer, and there's the oblique layer. And this allows for contraction in several different directions, very powerful contractions, which, while the food is held in the stomach, continue to break it down mechanically. The stomach is lined with gastric pits, from which is secreted mucus, hydrochloric acid, pepsin, gastrin, and the intrinsic factor. Please note that the hydrochloric acid is neat, it's pH of 2. The contents of the stomach are highly acidic, and one of the functions of the stomach is essentially to act as an acid bath that helps to kill off any bacteria and other foreign bodies that we may ingest along with our food. So here you can see a gastric pit. It's a small indentation on the wall of the stomach and the gastric gland below it. From the bottom it contains the chief cells, which contain the inactive form of the enzyme pepsinogen in the form of pepsin, the parietal cells which produce the hydrochloric acid, the mucous neck cells, the function of which is self-explanatory, and G cells which secrete gastrin. We'll come back to the function of gastrin later. Next we have the intestines, the small intestine and the large intestine, and we'll look at these in turn. In reality, these are all folded up together in the abdomen, but it's easier to look at them if we draw them out as follows. So this is very diagrammatic. You can see here the small intestine, which is connected to the stomach. The first region of the intestine is called the duodenum, the middle region is called the jejunum, and the bottom of the small intestine, where it connects to the large intestine at an area called the cecum, is the ileum. These are not entirely discrete areas, they're just very generalized areas of the small intestine. And then after the small intestine we have the colon. So let's look at the small intestine first of all. The small intestine propels food along it by peristalsis. This is just to remind you what peristalsis is, a wave of relaxation of circular muscle followed by a wave of contraction. Food is mixed in the small intestine by a process known as segmentation. And there are various types of segmentation, regular, irregular, isolated, weak aspects to it, and this ensures that the food is thoroughly mixed in the small intestine. The small intestine has a large surface area enabled by structures known as the villi. And the villi are finger-like projections, which you can see here, projecting into the lumen of the small intestine. And here's a three-dimensional picture of them. It's easier to see the structure and to understand the function of the villi if you look at this diagram here. Essentially, inside the villi there are two structures, blood vessels and lacteals. The blood vessels carry blood to and from the villi, and therefore to and from the small intestine, and the lacteals are branches of the lymphatic system. Here we can see in more detail these structures inside a single villus. The central lacteal is surrounded by a network of blood vessels, and as the colour of the blood vessels suggest, these bring blood which is oxygenated to the intestine and carry blood which is deoxygenated away. The blood that's carried away from the intestine also contains soluble nutrients such as amino acids and sugars. On the other hand, the lacteal exists there to absorb the fats that are broken down in the process of fat digestion. They are taken into the lymphatic system and returned to the blood circulation at the subclavian vein along with the lymph, which is drained from the other parts of the body, and then the metabolism of the fat continues from there. There are various secretions in the small intestine. First of all, sodium bicarbonate, which is alkaline and is there to neutralize the highly acidic contents of the stomach that enter in the form of chyme into the small intestine. There's a range of protein digesting enzymes here. Protein digestion actually begins by the action of pepsin in the stomach. It exists in an inactive form called pepsinogen, which is converted into pepsin in the presence of the acid in the stomach. So the protein digestion begins there but is carried on and completed in the small intestine in the presence of peptidase. Trypsin, which is asterisk because it's actually secreted by the pancreas. There are fat digesting enzymes here, lipase, again asterisk because this is secreted by the pancreas, and a range of carbohydrate digesting enzymes including amylase from the pancreas, but also maltase, sucrase and lactase, which are there to break down the sugars related to the names maltose, sucrose and lactose. Let's take a diversion and look at the pancreas now. The pancreas lies below the stomach and is linked to the small intestine at the area called the duodenum via the pancreatic duct. Contents of the pancreas enter the small intestine at the ampulla of Vater, which you can see on the inside of the duodenum, and this is controlled by the sphincter of Oddi. Here's a diagram which also includes the gallbladder, which we'll come back to, and the pancreas shown here, pancreatic duct inside it collecting the various enzymes which are secreted into the duodenum at the ampulla of Vater. Pancreatic secretions include trypsin, amylase, and lipase, which digest protein, carbohydrate and fat respectively. Let's continue this diversion by looking at the gallbladder. The gallbladder is connected to the liver and it's there to store the bile which is produced in the liver. The gallbladder doesn't actually produce anything. Bile is released via the ampulla of Vater, and bile is an emulsifying agent. It's not a digestive enzyme. An emulsifying agent breaks fat down into smaller globules which can then be acted upon by the lipases. Now we've already seen this diagram, it's really just there to remind you. This time focus on the gallbladder. The gallbladder is connected to the duodenum via the common bile duct, and bile enters the duodenum at the ampulla of Vater along with the contents of the pancreatic duct. At the top of the diagram you can see a branching there in the duct leading down to the gallbladder. That's the left and right hepatic ducts, and then the common hepatic duct which take bile down to the gallbladder. It's stored in the gallbladder, then the gallbladder is contracted during digestion and the contents are expelled one way down the common bile duct. And so we can see here that the function of the bile, or the bile salt strictly speaking, is to mix with large droplets of fat, break them down into smaller droplets or globules, which are then broken down ultimately into micelles, which can react with the pancreatic lipase and break the fat down into its constituents. These constituents are insoluble and they are actually absorbed, as indicated earlier, into the lacteal. The purpose of the small intestine is digestion. Digestion breaks large molecules down into smaller ones which can be absorbed in the intestine and used by the body in metabolism. The proteins involved in digestion, the amylases, lipases, pepsin and so forth, are called enzymes. This diagram just very crudely represents the digestion or the breakdown of proteins in blue and starch in red. Proteins are long chain molecules and the starch is a very branched molecule. Under enzymatic digestion, the proteins are broken down into peptides and ultimately into amino acids which can be absorbed into the bloodstream, and the starch is broken down into, it's composed entirely of glucose and broken down into maltose, which is a substance composed of two glucose molecules. These are further broken down into single molecules and absorbed into the bloodstream. The protein and the starch, these long chain molecules, are low osmotic pressure. The peptides and the maltose have high osmotic pressure. In other words, they take a lot of water with them. When these are broken down and absorbed into the bloodstream, the water is then absorbed into the bloodstream and thereby reabsorbed from the small intestine. So there are two things going on here at once. Digestion is controlled in three phases. They're not entirely discrete but general, but these three phases are the cephalic, the gastric and the intestinal phase. They're more or less self-explanatory, but we'll go through each in turn. The cephalic phase prepares the stomach for incoming food and lasts very briefly. The sight, smell, taste or thought of food can stimulate secretions. This stage is directed by the central nervous system and under the control of the vagus nerve. Parasympathetic fibres innervate the cells which secrete the gastric juices. The gastric phase begins with the arrival of food, causing the secretion of the hormone gastrin, which is released along with the stomach acid and the enzymes. This phase may last for several hours. And finally, the intestinal phase begins with the entrance of chyme into the small intestine, causing the secretion of many hormones, including secretin and cholecystokinin and gastric inhibitory peptide. The cholecystokinin stimulates, for example, the secretion of bile. gastric inhibitory peptide, the action of that is self-explanatory. As the intestinal phase kicks in, then the gastric phase is slowed down, and secretin helps to stimulate the secretion of other secretions in the small intestine, the enzymes and bicarbonate acid and so forth. Next, let's turn our attention to the large intestine. The large intestine, the main function of it is to act as a reservoir and an area for the reabsorption of water. It's linked to the small intestine by the ileocecal valve, which controls the entry of the contents of the small intestine into the large intestine. And this diagram, where the small intestine has been removed, shows the three regions of the large intestine, or the colon as it's also known: the ascending colon, transverse colon and descending colon. The names are self-explanatory. And after the descending colon you have the sigmoid colon, because it's S-shaped, and then the rectum. And this just shows the structure in slightly more detail, with the rectum labelled and also the appendix, which has no function in human beings, also shown. Here you see the small intestine with a couple of sections cut away. You'll notice several features here. Looked at from the inside, the structure is convoluted to allow for some expansion. The circular muscle isn't continuous along the length of the large intestine the way it is in the small intestine. It occurs in small bands leading to pouches known as haustra. And along the length, again, the longitudinal muscle isn't continuous. There are strips along the length of the large intestine called the tenia coli. So movement in the large intestine does take place by peristalsis. It also takes place by haustral churning, whereby the pouches churn the contents and move them in one direction along the large intestine. Remember, there's a valve at the ileum, so it can't move back into the small intestine. And also by mass movement, when the tenia coli, or the longitudinal strips of muscle, contract and again move contents of the large intestine principally down into the rectum. The large intestine contains bacteria, principally E. coli, and this plays an important role in the digestion of the residual products, whatever's left there after digestion has taken place. The large intestine produces waste products known as feces, and these are expelled from the body in a process known as defecation. Defecation takes place when the rectum fills up with feces. This is a process that could be seen as being analogous to that in the urinary bladder. We sense the stretching in the walls of the rectum, which tell us that we need to defecate, but this is under some control. At any rate, in adults in good health. There's an internal anal sphincter, which is smooth muscle. We can't control that. But there's an external anal sphincter, which is composed of skeletal muscle, and that is under voluntary control. So we can defecate when it's convenient. Again, like the reflexes in the urinary bladder, these develop in children when they're around 2 years old. So the gastrointestinal system runs from the mouth to the anus. It's responsible for the ingestion and digestion of food and the excretion of waste products, and topologically it lies outside of the body. Now some questions. 1. Describe the GI system. GI means gastrointestinal. 2. What are the 4 main regions of the GI tract between mouth and anus? 3. Name 4 organs or structures that are linked to the GI tract. 4. Describe the peritoneum and what is the space that it encloses called. 5. What kind of muscle is found in the GI tract? How is it arranged and how is it controlled? 6. What is the process that moves food along the GI tract? Describe this process. 7. What is the space in the GI tract called and what is the lining of the GI tract called? What are the two functions of the lining? 8. Name the 3 pairs of salivary glands. What is the main function of saliva? 9. What is mastication? In addition to saliva, what other parts of the mouth are involved? What is the end product of mastication? 10. What are the muscles of mastication? Which joint is involved and what is unique about it? 11. In the process of swallowing, which tube does the bolus of food enter on its way to the stomach? Which tube is protected by the epiglottis and what is the epiglottis? How is the bolus of food moved to the stomach? 12. What are the functions of the stomach? 13. What are the 3 muscle layers of the stomach and what are the convolutions on the inner surface of the stomach called? 14. State the 3 regions of the small intestine in the correct order. 15. What are the functions of the small intestine? 16. What features of the lining of the small intestine provide it with a large surface area? What are the 3 groups of enzymes, i.e. in terms of what they digest, that are secreted into the small intestine? 17. Where do pancreatic secretions enter the duodenum? In addition to sodium bicarbonate, what digestive enzymes are produced by the pancreas? 18. Where is bile made? What does the gallbladder do? Where is bile released into the duodenum? What does bile do? 19. Describe digestion. 20. What do enzymes do? What are the 3 phases of digestion? 21. What is mainly reabsorbed in the large intestine and what are the 3 major regions of the large intestine? 22. What are the 3 types of movement in the large intestine and which bacterium is mainly found here? 23. Describe the structure and function of the internal and external anal sphincters. I don't expect you to find all of the answers to these questions in the lecture that I've just given you. I expect you will be able to find the answers to some of these questions by doing your own work, looking these up on the internet or in your own textbooks. But some of the answers will be found in my blog, 4 Things About, a simple approach to anatomy and physiology, specifically under the entry, the gastrointestinal system. Thank you very much for listening.